They came to our land convinced that they would take Kyiv in 3 days. For a long time, the Russian army was firmly convinced that it had a monopoly on violence and would remain unpunished as a result. However, the Kremlin's plans were not meant to come true because Ukraine had prepared some very unpleasant surprises for the occupiers. Dangerous, effective, destructive, but most importantly, cluster munitions that are so essential for the armed forces of Ukraine. The intensity of the fighting on the front line sets its own terms. According to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, Ukraine uses between 4,000 and 7,000 artillery shells every day. To grasp the scale of this expenditure, consider this simple fact. Every day, the Ukrainian armed forces fire off what would be a year's worth of orders for the army of a small European country.
For Bucha, for Irpin, for Azov. Glory to the Ukrainians!
Despite significant assistance from allies and the accuracy of Ukrainian artillery, Russia's artillery stockpiles, accumulated since Soviet times, give the occupiers an advantage on the front in terms of shell usage. But new American arms deliveries will help Ukraine deal with this nascent problem and more. To begin with, it should be clarified, a cluster munition is a type of air-to-ground or ground-to-ground ammunition. When it detonates in the air, such a shell releases, or in other words, ejects dozens of sub-munitions that scatter over a radius of up to 100 meters. They are activated and explode independently of each other, creating a wide area of effective damage. Cluster munitions will become a serious factor on the battlefield, as they are precisely what can compensate for the occupiers' numerical advantage in high explosive fragmentation shells.
The concentration of a large number of sub-munitions, that is, small munitions, which during their flight, as they approach the target, are dispersed over an area by the opening of the warhead itself. In other words, they are scattered through the air while the shell is still in flight, spread over a wide area, and then detonate, explode when they hit the surface. In this way, a much larger area is covered, thereby causing even greater damage to the enemy, both to personnel and, of course, to equipment.
Depending on the type date of cluster munition, it can be used by aircraft, artillery, and of course, multiple launch rocket systems. Back at the beginning of this year, the first reports appeared in the press about negotiations between Ukraine and the United States regarding the transfer of Mk-20 cluster aerial bombs. At that time, official Kyiv planned to modify the munition for deployment from drones. In turn, is actively using the Smerch and Uragan multiple launch rocket systems to carry out strikes with cluster munitions. For example, in the spring and summer of 2022, the occupiers dropped hundreds of such munitions on the heads of Kharkiv's civilian residents. And now Ukraine has something to respond to the occupiers with. From the United States, we are receiving M864 and .M483A1 model munitions. These shells are suitable for 155mm in howitzers. The area of effect against enemy personnel is at least the size of a football field. Thus, a single cluster munition accomplishes the task of nearly 10 high explosive fragmentation shells.
Striking a large area, they make it possible with a single shot to cover a much larger area than with a single shot of unitary munitions, roughly 4 to 5 times more or even greater.
A significant factor in supplying Ukraine with cluster munitions was, in large part, the depletion of traditional artillery shell stockpiles in the West. And while European defense industries are unable to keep up with the needs of Ukrainians at the front, the US still has between 4 and 8 million cluster shells and bombs available to supply Ukraine. Of course, it should also be mentioned that in 2008, more than 110 countries around the world signed a convention in Oslo under which they renounced the use and production of cluster munitions. However, neither Ukraine nor the US, nor Russia signed this convention.
This is due to the fact that when these potentially dangerous munitions are scattered over an area, there is always a chance that some of them will not successfully detonate and will instead remain on the ground as delayed action mines, which can be extremely hazardous. And after the territories are finally liberated, civilians who are returning to their homes in these areas may unfortunately fall victim to these hazardous munitions.
Although Ukraine and the US did not sign the convention, most of Ukraine's allies are in fact signatory countries. For this very reason, several of our partners immediately spoke out against the US decision.
Legally, we are not violating anything in this matter. On the other hand, we have every moral right to use all means to defend ourselves from the Russian aggressor, who is also using cluster munitions. Moreover, this makes up the majority of their arsenal since in the Soviet Union, due to the low accuracy of multiple launch rocket systems, they tried to increase their effectiveness by using cluster munitions.
Cluster munitions are banned in many countries around the world because of the high rate of unexploded submunitions. Sometimes up to 20% of them fail to detonate. Whether they detonate depends on the type, model, and the surface the munition lands on. For example, if it's hard ground, the percentage will be minimal. But if the submunitions fall into water or onto plowed fields, the number of unexploded charges increases significantly. That is precisely why, during negotiations over the transfer of cluster munitions, Ukraine made several commitments not to use cluster munitions on internationally recognized Russian territory or near populated areas. At the same time, after the occupation and Ukraine's victory, the areas where American cluster munitions were used will be prioritized for demining. And finally, Ukraine will inform its partners about the use of this weapon, and of course about its effectiveness.
No matter what anyone thinks, we are not making the situation worse. And the level of risk for civilians is not increasing. All levels of risk, all sources of danger come exclusively from the Russian Federation.
Ukrainian heroes have long needed cluster munitions, especially acutely during the counteroffensive against the well-prepared, dense positions of the occupiers in southern Ukraine. Cluster munitions will allow the armed forces of Ukraine to inflict serious damage on Russian troops. They will be especially useful against occupiers, entrenched in trenches. And perhaps most importantly, during the offensive, cluster munitions are capable of minimizing Ukraine's personnel losses. Cluster munitions are just one cog in the vast machine of the armed forces of Ukraine. We'll talk about another such tool, which helps our soldiers grind down the enemy on the battlefield every day in the next episode. Believe me, the armed forces of Ukraine have plenty to surprise the occupiers with. So be sure to like this video and write in the comments which types of weapons you'd like to learn more about. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes of Arsenal.
It is capable of flying hundreds of kilometers deep into enemy territory, and it is extremely difficult to shoot down with Russian air defense systems. It can penetrate almost any bunker, and when it detonates at a position, it leaves a crater dozens of meters deep. Nearly half a ton of explosives allows it to destroy bridges, roads, railway lines, command posts, and any concentration of equipment. And yes, soon the occupiers will feel all of this for themselves. After all, Ukraine has officially confirmed the receipt of French long-range SCALP missiles. This missile is the result of joint work by French and British companies. The project, which began back in 1996, resulted in the early 2000s in the production of two cruise missiles, Storm Shadow for the United Kingdom and SCALP for the French army. Both missiles are almost identical but differ in their software and interface. Since its development, The missile has been repeatedly upgraded, which has allowed its range to be more than doubled. The destructive capability also significantly increased after the designers modified the warhead. SCALP missiles, which are air-to-ground class, are launched from aircraft. There are also versions designed for launches from the sea. Originally developed for NATO aircraft, the missile was for a long time unsuitable for use by Ukrainian pilots. But last year our engineers modified the missile mounts, and today this problem no longer exists.
They are launched from an aircraft, the Su-24 bomber. They fly at low altitudes up to 30 meters, making them hard to detect by radar. They fly fast for this type of missile, about 1,000 kilometers per hour.
It is worth noting that there are several types of SCALP. A missile for the domestic French market with a range of over 560 kilometers, and an export version which Ukraine received. Its range is 290 kilometers and the minimum altitude is 30 meters. With a length of just over 5 meters, the missile reaches a speed of about 1,000 kilometers per hour. The SCALP's warhead weighs 450 kilograms, which allows it to destroy even well-fortified shelters.
A single such missile has the explosive potential of 4 HIMARS rockets. This is a rather significant capability, enough to wipe out the positions or concentrations of Russian occupiers' equipment at a base where there was a dense concentration of such equipment and so on. The missile has quite substantial destructive capabilities.
Ukraine became the 10th country in the world to receive missiles of this type in its arsenal. The first SCALPs were received and personally signed for by Volodymyr Zelensky on Ukraine's Air Force Day. By the way, the SCALP also comes with a cluster-type warhead. Just a few of these missiles can easily destroy, for example, an airfield or a concentration of enemy equipment. The main warhead of the Broch type also comes with a surprise. As it approaches the target, it fires a submunition that makes the initial penetration. Then the main charge flies in, detonating inside the target with a slight delay.
The priority targets are ammunition supply routes, food supply routes for personnel, and also water supply routes. So now, let's look at the map and start guessing where will they be used. There. Armyansk, Perekop, right? There's some highway running there. It's unnecessary, but it's used for supply. There's a railway running along Volnovakha and almost up to Kamenets. Well, it's clear that everything there has already been cut off or is being cut off. That's it. Jankoy, the Crimean Bridge. So these are basically the main targets for this type of missile.
The guidance principle deserves special attention. It consists of 5 components at once. The TERPROM and TERCOM systems allow the missile to fly at extremely low altitudes, skirting terrain obstacles on its way to the target. The missile is also equipped with an infrared homing head with a target recognition mode. In addition, the principle of inertial guidance is used based on data from the built-in GPS.
Here you can see the GPS system. This is the navigation that constantly corrects the missile's flight so that it goes exactly in the right direction, because when it's maneuvering between hills, even a few dozen meters can make a big difference, so that it doesn't crash into an uneven surface like Russian missiles, which have hit houses and various hills.
It's also noteworthy to mention that these missiles do not actually require numerous launchers. They are launched from aircraft that Ukraine has already modified. There is simply no need to launch dozens of missiles simultaneously as Russia does. After all, the SCALP has proven itself to be an extremely precise weapon.
You really don't need a particularly large number of them at all to use it.
Launch systems, you only need just a few of these types of aircraft, up to about 10 in total, because this weapon isn't designed for mass use. It's specifically intended for precision strikes on enemy targets.
The cherry on top for the Russians will be their first attempts to shoot down these missiles. Thanks to its low-altitude flight profile and relatively high speed, the SCALP cruise missile has quite low radar visibility.
As for the SCALP, this missile is equipped with a suite of guidance systems that are rather difficult to suppress, especially if we're talking about electronic warfare, for example.
Russian air defense systems, developed in the 1980s, are almost incapable of intercepting modernized SCALP missiles.
They can't create faster acting systems that would respond more quickly, fly faster, and be controlled more rapidly. In other words, they would need faster processors and faster computers that could calculate the trajectory and destroy these missiles. They are unable to do this.
The exact number of SCALP missiles France has supplied to Ukraine is secret. Likewise, there is no information about the quantity of previously received Storm Shadow equivalents. But one thing is certain, the Ukrainian armed forces have significantly replenished their stock of long-range missiles. So, in the near future, we can expect even more gifts to rain down on the occupiers. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. That way, you won't miss our new episodes. Even more interesting facts about weapons and military equipment are coming up in the next episode of Arsenal.